The first shock came not on the battlefield, but when I returned home. I had just completed a year-long deployment overseas, serving under desert suns and sleeping in sandstorms, carrying the weight of duty and the promise that home would still be mine when I returned. But when I pulled into my street, duffel bags in hand, heart racing at the thought of hugging my daughter on that porch, my blood turned to ice. Strangers stood in the yard. My American flag was gone. The lock had been changed. And sitting smugly in a lawn chair, clipboard in hand, was Karen, the HOA president who had always found some excuse to target me. She rose with a smirk that could rot steel. "You're trespassing," she declared, as though I were an intruder on my own land. "This house has been sold under HOA authority. You abandoned it. It belongs to new owners now." Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac, each word dripping with arrogance, her wide frame blocking the path to my own front door. I froze, staring at her in disbelief. "Sold?" I managed, my throat tightening. "Karen, I was deployed. I paid every tax, every mortgage. How dare you?" But she waved her fake papers like a weapon, cutting off my words. "You weren't here. You left your yard unattended. We considered it derelict. We followed procedure. The HOA owns this subdivision, and we voted to repossess. It's done." The neighbors stood in hushed silence, some ashamed, others looking away, unwilling to challenge the tyrant who had ruled them for years. Rage roared in my chest, but training steadied me. I pulled my phone from my pocket, recording every word, every smug grin, every fake deed she brandished. I spoke clearly, loudly enough for every porch to hear. "Karen, you sold a military family's home while they were deployed. That's not just fraud, it's a federal crime." For the first time, her smirk faltered just slightly. By nightfall, my video was online. Within hours, it exploded. Veterans groups, military families, even politicians shared it. Outrage poured in like a flood. The twist came the next morning when 2 Humvees rolled into the subdivision, dust swirling as uniformed military police stepped out, followed by a JAG officer. They weren't there for Methy, were there for Karen. The officer read the charges aloud, his voice steady and merciless. Fraudulent sale of military property, forgery of legal documents, harassment of a service member's family. Karen sputtered, waving her clipboard, but her voice cracked under the weight of the uniforms surrounding her. She shouted that the HOA had supreme authority, that no soldier was above the rules. But the soldiers didn't flinch. Neighbors filmed as she shrieked, her face crimson, her arrogance unraveling in real time. And then came the final blow. The JAG officer unrolled a map, pointing to the subdivision. "This entire HOA has been operating illegally, extorting residents, and interfering with federally protected housing rights. As of today, this subdivision is under federal seizure for investigation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Families who had lived in fear of Karen's fines suddenly realized the empire that bound them was crumbling in one swift strike. Karen collapsed to her knees, screaming that she was the victim, that I had orchestrated this to humiliate her. Deputies cuffed her wrists, dragging her past the neighbors she had terrorized. For once, no one looked away. Some even applauded. Children who had been told not to ride bikes on the sidewalk clapped as the woman who stole their joy was hauled away. But the story didn't end there. As investigators combed through HOA records, a darker truth emerged. Karen hadn't acted alone. She had worked with a shady developer, signing fake deeds and pocketing money from sales of properties that weren't hers to touch. My house wasn't the only one she had tried to seize. Others had been targeted too, families who had been too scared to fight back. My case was simply the spark that set fire to her empire of lies. Neighbors who had been silent for years stepped forward, emboldened. One elderly couple admitted they'd nearly lost their home to Karen's schemes. A young mother revealed she'd been fined thousands for unapproved decorations. Each testimony piled higher, a mountain of truth crushing Karen's name. The climax came at the federal courthouse. Karen, disheveled and trembling but still trying to posture, shouted about conspiracies. But the evidence was undeniable. Fake signatures, altered bank records, videos of her declaring herself the ultimate authority. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, she screamed so loudly that even the judge banged his gavel to silence her. Her sentence was brutal, but just years in prison, millions in restitution, a lifetime ban from any property management. She was led away sobbing, her once proud empire reduced to nothing but shame. The neighborhood, free at last, transformed. The HOA was dissolved by court order, replaced with a cooperative committee run by volunteers. Instead of Karen's fines and threats, we had barbecues and cleanups. My cabin yard, once her prize target, became the heart of the community again. Children played, flags waved, laughter filled the air. The stain of fear had been scrubbed away. And me? I stood on the porch with my daughter in my arms, the sun setting behind us, the flag restored to its rightful place. Neighbors clapped, saluted, and thanked Menet just for my service abroad, but for standing firm at home. Karen sold my house, but in doing so, she sold her soul, and the price was her own downfall. The news of the seizure spread like wildfire. What had started as a local scandal about one arrogant HOA president suddenly became a national headline. Veterans organizations blasted it across their social media feeds, demanding accountability for every HOA that had ever harassed military families. Talk shows ran segments replaying the clip of Karen being dragged away, her shrieks echoing as neighbors clapped and soldiers looked on. She had tried to humiliate me, but instead she had humiliated herself before the entire country. The next week, federal investigators swarmed the subdivision. They didn't just come for Karen, they came for every file, every ledger, every fraudulent fine the HOA had levied. Families who had paid special assessments for projects that never existed now had a chance to see where their money went. The truth was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned off into shell accounts tied to Karen and her developer partner. Vacant lots sold under false deeds. Even maintenance budgets had been looted, explaining why potholes lingered for years, while Karen boasted about her perfectly balanced books. Neighbors who had once whispered their resentment now shouted their rage. At emergency meetings, people stood up and told their stories. A widowed veteran confessed he had been threatened with foreclosure after missing one payment during his wife's cancer treatments. A young couple revealed they had been fined for noise every time their toddler cried at night. One by one, the curtain lifted on a theater of cruelty that Karen had directed with relish. The crowd seethed, not just at her, but at themselves for staying silent so long. The twist arrived when one man, nervous and pale, stood up and introduced himself as Mark, a contractor who had done odd jobs for the HOA. He admitted he had been complicit, paid under the table to forge signatures on Karen's fake deeds. His voice cracked as he apologized. She threatened me, said she'd ruin my business if I didn't play along. But watching her drag a soldier's family through hell, I couldn't carry it anymore. His testimony was the nail in the coffin. With his records and the files from the HOA office, prosecutors had everything they needed to build a case not just against Karen, but against the developer who had backed her schemes. In the weeks that followed, subpoenas turned into arrests. Board members resigned en masse, some fleeing town. The developer was charged with fraud and racketeering, his assets frozen. And Karen? She sat in a county cell awaiting federal trial, her empire of control crumbling into rubble. The irony was bitter. The woman who claimed she protected property values had destroyed them all, leaving a row of multimillion-dollar homes sinking under the weight of scandal. The climax came at trial. The courthouse was packed to bursting. Neighbors, veterans, reporters from every major network. Karen shuffled in wearing a faded suit that hung awkwardly on her frame, but her eyes still burned with that same defiance. She tried to speak, tried to claim she had only followed community standards, but the evidence played louder than her voice. Recordings of her declaring herself above the law. Spreadsheets tracing stolen money into her personal accounts. Videos of her waving fake deeds and screaming at me. When the jury filed back in, the silence was electric. The foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and harassment of a service member's family. The judge's sentence was swift and merciless. Over a decade in prison, millions in restitution, and a permanent bar from any role connected to housing or property management. Karen collapsed into her chair, sobbing, her hands shaking as deputies pulled her away in chains. But it wasn't just her fall that mattered, it was what rose from the ashes. The subdivision, freed from her grip, voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA entirely. In its place, a cooperative neighborhood council formed, focused not on punishing but on building. People repaired fences together, pooled resources for community projects, and for the first time in years, children rode their bikes down the street without fear of a fine. My home, once the target of Karen's cruelty, became a gathering place. We held barbecues in the yard, strung up lanterns in the trees, and invited every neighbor who had once lived under her shadow. The military's role didn't end with Karen's arrest. They designated the subdivision as a case study for protecting service members' housing rights, launching new legislation to ensure no soldier's family could ever be targeted by an HOA again. What Karen had meant as a petty grab for power became the catalyst for national change. I'll never forget the moment my daughter raised our flag again. The neighbors stood with us, veterans saluting, children waving small flags of their own. The fabric caught the wind, snapping strong and proud, a symbol that home had endured, that justice had prevailed. My throat tightened as I looked around, not just at the house restored to us, but at a community reborn. Karen thought she could sell my home while I was gone. Instead, she sold her own soul, and the price was everything. So now I ask you, was her prison sentence and the collapse of her subdivision enough justice? Or do you believe someone who preys on soldiers' families deserves an even harsher reckoning?